streaming this, so we're going live at 6:30 on the dot, so I don't want to start talking too soon. But I'm sure the guys at the back will tell me if we're live. Cool. On behalf of Some Frontier Associates, can I thank you all for coming today. We're very lucky to have the Foreign Minister of DRC with us. She'll be a Q&A session, stroke interview session with Diana Magnay of Sky TV. At the end of which, there'll be questions from the floor, should you have them. There'll be a roving mic. Please ask questions. And I think those of you here tonight know that the situation in the east of the DRC, if I said is not good, it would be an understatement. It's been going on since about 2012, on and off. There are, as the Minister will tell you, there are millions of displaced people. The drivers are everything from ethnic to mining wealth, and I think President Kagame has been called out numerous times now that the Rwandans are playing games in the eastern DRC. It's in their interest to have that region destabilized. The problem is, innocent people are dying as a result, and something has to be done to stop it. The Foreign Minister has been on a whirlwind tour of Europe. I know tomorrow she's off to Paris and then beyond, so we're quite lucky to have her in London tonight. So you want to hear from her, not from me. So without further ado, can I say, Diana, the Minister is all yours. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, and thank you very much for being here, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I wanted to start off by asking you what the current situation is on the ground. The assault on Goma at the end of January happened very fast. M23 backed by 4,000 troops from Rwanda with heavy weaponry from Rwanda, pushing south towards Bukavu now. But there seems to be a kind of pause, and given the fact that we've seen pictures of soldiers surrendering, uniforms on the ground in Goma, senior leadership fleeing across Lake Kivu, who is standing against M23 as they continue south, and what's the situation now?
Well, first and foremost, it is the Congolese people who are standing against the M23. And I think this is a strong testament to the fact that this has never been an endeavor that has any legitimacy within the Congolese population. I think it's extremely important to highlight it. When we look at the methods of warfare that the M23 backed by Rwanda, by the Rwandan Defense Forces, have employed, they were nothing short of extremely violent against civilians, against also key infrastructure in Goma. And so while we are observing a lull, if you want, right now, and that is maybe a result of the summit that we had yesterday between SADC and the East African community, while we are observing that, we need to be cognizant of the fact that the situation on the ground still is extremely dire and dramatic. I want to remind us that when the M23 and the RDF attacked the city of Goma, they cut all of the supply roads into the city of Goma, meaning that people could not flee in or out of Goma, meaning that food that comes from the territories around Goma could not get into the city, meaning also that, that supply could not be brought into the city of Goma. They attacked in a very deliberate manner the airport, meaning that you could not have any supplies in terms of humanitarian supplies, but also rotation of staff and so on and so forth, and basically concentrating any access in or out of Goma to the border post between Goma and Gisenyi. So we are in a situation right now where humanitarian access is extremely limited. It is controlled by Rwanda. I just spoke with our colleague, the Minister of Health, who informs me that Rwandan authorities even want to impose taxes on any humanitarian convoy getting into the DRC. And so it is a continuous siege. And in the midst of that, we have flagrant human rights violations. We have reports of human rights defenders, civil society members, journalists being chased by the M23. We have IDP camps being disbanded forcibly. And so an overarching situation of extreme threats to civilian lives and to key infrastructure, which is completely contrary to the so-called, altruistic or, humanitarian, if you want, or salvaging nature that the M23 is trying to portray itself as. In terms of the situation, I think that's where we currently stand. Fighting has subdued, but again, I think this is linked to the fact that yesterday there was an important meeting that renewed, if you want, the need to find diplomatic solutions to the situation.
You think that halts the rebels?
I think it had pressure on the rebels, at least in the lead up to this summit. We saw that the M23 issued a press statement claiming that they were, putting in place a ceasefire. And I think that this is part of their rhetoric and also of their communication strategy to appear, if you want, as a legitimate interlocutor. But we've seen it from the past. The M23 has very often declared ceasefires, has very often declared wanting to protect people, but has not shied away of tactics and warfare that is not discriminate, that targets civilians, and that in no manner seeks to protect the interests of civilians in whatever manner. So I think this was a way of posturing and of presenting themselves. And I think what we're seeing now in the aftermath of the summit is the continuation of that effort. But we know the M23, we have known them for a very long time, we know their methods. We also know who is behind the M23, and we know that they have no compunction whatsoever when it comes to sparing civilian lives.
What do you make of the communique from the summit, which essentially asked Kinshasa to talk to all parties involved and to follow on with a combined Luanda-Nairobi peace process, and for army chiefs at some point to come together in the next few days and develop a plan to stop this from happening? Because presumably if M23 moves towards Bukavu, Burundian troops are going to be involved. This could escalate further. What do you make of that summit outcome? Are you going to be talking to M23? What do you think the next step has to be?
So what is important about the summit outcome is that it reiterated the validity and the pertinence of two important frameworks, the Luanda process and the Nairobi process. Now, when we speak of merger, we speak of both of them being under the umbrella of the African Union, but still maintaining the two tracks. The Luanda process is one between states. It's between the DRC, Angola, and Rwanda. The Nairobi process is a process between the Congolese government with the facilitation of President Uhuru Kenyatta and with non-state actors. And so even when we speak of a merger, even when we speak about both of them being under the umbrella of the African Union, they still have two very distinct tracks, and these distinct tracks will be maintained. So we extend an offer to the M23, despite the fact that they were already part of the Nairobi process and were removed because they renewed their attacks against the army. We extend the offer to engage in a constructive dialogue and to engage in consultations through the Nairobi process, just as all other non-state actors are supposed to. So I think this is an important nuance to bear in mind, even when we speak of a merger and even when we speak of the two processes coming together under the umbrella of the AU, they still have very distinct tracks that target distinct stakeholders and that have different levels of responsibility and accountability. It's also important that the summit drew some important conclusions linked to the city of Goma itself and the imperative to reestablish access, physical access to the city of Goma. And we hope that we will see very rapidly progress in that sense happening, be it in terms of, the logistic access to Goma through roads, the lake, or through the airport. And this is critical because this is the lifeline for millions of Congolese citizens, but also for humanitarian workers and for UN peacekeepers. We keep on kind of, forgetting that this is a crisis that has been very indiscriminate in its attack. We have had in less than 72 hours over 15 United Nations and SADC peacekeepers killed. We had thousands of Congolese civilians killed, you know, and so the indiscriminate nature of the attack is something that seems to, you know, to be forgotten. But at the same time, when we look at strategic issues such as the airport, we realize it's a lifeline not just for the Congolese population, but also for MONUSCO, but also for humanitarians. And so it's of critical importance that, you know, this be restored.
You were in Goma in 2012, the last time M23 came in. Mm-hmm. How does this compare?
Obviously, I've experienced this episode from afar, from a different position also in terms of where I stand professionally. But right from the start, it was evident that we were not looking at a repeat of 2012 in terms of the type of warfare, in terms of the brutality of the warfare, in terms of the sophistication of the weaponry that was used. I would dare say that this is not reminiscent of 2012, but this is reminiscent of Rwanda and its tactics in Eastern DRC in the late 90s. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at IDP camps being forcibly disbanded. We're looking at people being disappeared. We're looking at thousands of people being killed in a span of a few days. The first estimations that we had were speaking of 300 people. And then the next day it was 700. And then it was 2,900. And then it's 3,000. And, you know, from what we hear on the ground, it's so much more than that. You know, you have bodies decaying on the roadside. You have the morgues being overfilled. You have fausse commune, how do you call that? You have mass graves that have to be dug up because people are just overrun with all of these bodies. You know, so this is not the M23 of 2012, and this is not Rwanda of 2012. This is Rwanda that has been emboldened and empowered for the past 3 years by the inaction of all of its partners, of all of its backers, of the Security Council of the United Nations. And this is a Rwanda that has been arming to a level where it outgunned the United Nations. They said it specifically, explicitly, and that in a manner that has outweighed all the capacities on the ground. So this is in no way comparable to 2012. And then when you see the rhetoric of the M23, this is also a Rwanda that is seeking violent regime change. So it's not just violating our territorial integrity. It is not just violating our sovereignty. It is not just killing civilians and pretending to be protecting others while they attack in an indiscriminate manner. It is also backing violent regime change. This is us going back decades into the most dark ages of the African continent. And this is why our advocacy and our plaidoyer goes, you know, both to the Security Council, but also to the African Union. Is this the Africa we want in 2025?
Rwanda obviously says that they are trying to protect ethnic Tutsis in the DRC. You have always had a problem in terms of the Congolese army's association with the FDLR. That remains an issue. Mm-hmm. What is the problem in sort of disentangling yourself from the FDLR and neutralizing them? Mm-hmm. And a second question about the nature of the army. You know, it is unfortunately not as disciplined as the Rwandan army. Mm-hmm. We have today reports of 75 soldiers being put on trial for having surrendered, looted, murdered in the Congolese army. They are paid very, very little, and they see mercenaries from Romania getting paid thousands of dollars every month. How can you try and resist a neo-imperial Rwanda with a force like that? Mm-hmm. And what can you do about bolstering it?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think this is also a lesson that we have to, you know, there are a lot of learnings that we have to take from this experience, and I think that this is already on the way. I think it's not just unfortunate, it is inexcusable that we had members of the armed forces attack civilians and prey upon civilians. Now, if there is a silver lining to this, then it is the fact that 10 years ago, they wouldn't be on trial 72 hours later. I think progress takes time. I think we all wish it took less time, especially now. And I think it's work in progress, unfortunately, and there's some hard lessons that we're learning as things evolve. But at the same time, as I said, you know, it's also about being cognizant of the fact that this has been not a fight between the FARDC and the M23 that is portrayed as a small armed group that is defending the interests or the well-being of an ethnic minority. First of all, in a country as large as the DRC, everyone is a minority. Let's just be clear about that. And this is not proper to the DRC. I think there are very few countries on the African continent that are as, you know, that have as little, you know, ethnic groups as some of our neighbors. But all African countries, I believe, grapple with the challenges of multiple ethnicities and also of communities being split along the borders that we have inherited from colonial times. So, you know, this is a reality that is not proper to the DRC. This is a challenge that is not proper to the DRC, but it is proper to us to see how we deal with it in the most adequate manner. And I think there is a case to be made to the efforts that have been also made by the Congolese government to ensure greater representation, greater inclusion of ethnic minorities such as the Banyamulenge. Could things be better? Certainly. But at the same time, this is a sovereign issue. Just as Rwanda has decided a few decades ago to ban the use of ethnic identities, isn't it? In Rwanda, you cannot be Tutsi. In Rwanda, you cannot be Hutu. And you cannot be Twa. That's divisionism. And that is their way of processing their very burdened history. And we respect that because it is their sovereign right. But there is a need also to understand that our sovereignty has to be respected. So this discourse, if you want, of recognizing ethnic diversity and engaging on it and using it as an entry point whilst back home it does not exist, you know, lacks a bit of equilibrium. The question of the FDLR, you know, it has been a recurring one. I want to remind us of the fact that the Congolese army on many occasions launched operations against the FDLR, unilateral operations, multilateral with the MONUSCO peacekeeping force, but also bilateral. We actually let the Rwandan troops in our territory to deal with the FDLR. We had reached a point where even the Rwandan ambassador to the DRC said they no longer pose a threat. And all of a sudden, they pose a threat again. No problem. No problem at all. We went to the Luanda process. We had a deal that had to be signed on the 15th. And that deal had two main obligations or commitments. Rwanda was to withdraw its troops from the DRC, the so-called defensive measures. And the DRC was supposed to engage in the dismantling of the FDLR. Now, if this was such an important issue for Rwanda, why did President Kagame not show up on 15th of December to sign this agreement? We would be 2 months down the line of neutralizing the FDLR right now. And yet they insisted that this agreement includes a clause that foresees a direct dialogue between the M23 and the Congolese government. And it seems that that was more important to President Kagame than actually signing a deal where we would commit to neutralizing the FDLR.
And that is something that you won't engage with, talks with M23, because they are...
Well, there is a forum for that, and it's the Nairobi process. It's the process that is foreseen for consultations with non-state actors, and we have not backed down from that. In every one of my statements at the Security Council, in every one of my engagements with my counterparts, we reiterate the fact that we have a mechanism in place for non-state actors, and we have a mechanism in place for interstate diffusion of tensions, if you want, and that is the Luanda process. Now, unfortunately, on 15th of December, the Rwandan government and the Rwandan president, more specifically, did not come to Luanda for the signature of the agreement. And since then, negotiations have stalled or have ruptured. They left the negotiating table, or they left the dialogue. We never left. And Angola never left either. So what we find ourselves in is a situation where there was a framework, there was a dialogue, and one party decided to leave that dialogue and that process towards a political solution, the political solution we have all been urged to prioritize, and basically a few weeks later launched an attack on Goma.
Do you think that President Kagame, I know you can't speak for him, but feels emboldened by a sort of generalized language of Trumpian discourse, by Putin invading Ukraine, I'm often asked when Trump talks about invading, taking Greenland or the Panama Canal or whatever it may be, that he is emboldening autocrats around the world. But presumably Kagame must have been planning this for a long time now.
Well, I don't think that he's emboldened by the actions or the posturing of countries that we see, of countries such as the USA or the Russian Federation, because he is nowhere comparable to them. President Kagame is not emboldened by that. He's emboldened by the passivity and by the inaction of his backers. He is emboldened by impunity and 30 years of impunity. This is the issue. Rwanda is not a superpower. Rwanda is emboldened by the fact that no one holds them accountable, and no one has held them accountable for the past 30 years. This is what emboldens President Kagame. And the very fact that on the eve of the attack against Goma and of, the conquest, if you want, of Goma, President Kagame reportedly received so many phone calls from so many world leaders, from so many world powers, and did not flinch. Shows you that he's emboldened by impunity.
Because he has the money coming in from his various deals with the EU. I mean, we have, if we just take the EU, we have the Memorandum of Understanding on minerals, clean minerals coming from Rwanda to boost the EU's green and renewable energy. You have spoken to the EU, you called it, was very powerful, a cacophony of inaction around Rwanda. I know that the US has stopped military aid to both the DRC and Rwanda in the way that they have across the board. Are you being heard when you go and talk internationally? Are governments sitting up and listening and deciding to stop aid or stop these deals?
I'm convinced that I'm being heard. Now, whether the fact that I'm being heard translates into action, that is something that I cannot be held accountable for. But trust and believe, as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the DRC, I am being heard, and I am making sure that I am heard, and that I will not stop being heard. So that is my job. Now, what the others make of it, not just of my voice, and in these situations of conflict, it is important to also try to, gravitate towards at least what we can call a common ground or a semblance of objective truth. So whilst my voice is there, there's also some objective truth that has been gathered. I bring us back to the reports of the group of experts. When I come to the UK is a permanent member of the Security Council. They know the ins and outs. They know all of these mechanisms and all of these, instruments that the Security Council disposes of. The Sanctions Committee, the group of experts, and that very group of experts, these experts that have been vetted by the Security Council and that have been mandated by the Security Council, go into the DRC, go to Rwanda and the region, and come back and say, well, you know what? We think there's at least 4,000 Rwandan troops in the DRC. We also think that there are more Rwandan troops than M23. We also see that there's at least 150 metric tons of coltan that are mined illegally through forced labor of women, children, men by the M23 and the Rwandan Defense Forces, exported by Rwanda under a Rwandan label. This is not the DRC saying it. If I were to speak about what we see and what we perceive Rwanda's role and footprint to be, it would be much worse. But let's just take that minimum of objective truth that at least the Security Council has agreed on. And that is what I confront my different interlocutors with. It's not just my voice. It's not just the voice of Congolese citizens and civil society organizations. It's also the voice and the outcome of the instruments that the international community has equipped itself with in order to maintain international peace and security.
And what would you like to see them do?
So first of all, of course, sanctions. Sanctions because the group of experts report establishes a clear link between the M23 and the RDF in terms of command structure. So there is a chain of command between the two, and there is a need to hold different members of this chain of command accountable. So sanctions targeting RDF commanders, but also targeting the politicians and the decision makers that have granted the RDF this authority, or if you want, these resources to collaborate in the way they are with the M23. Second of all, I think there's a very clear case that is to be made on an embargo on natural resources coming from Rwanda. It's very evident that they are mined in inhumane conditions and that they are sold in a fraudulent manner as if they were from Rwanda. So a memorandum of understanding that apparently seems to understand nothing of natural resources in the Great Lakes region. The third point, more visibility when it comes to arms transfers and sales to the Rwandan Defense Forces. So what is interesting is that Rwanda has, over the years, established itself as a provider of security services, if you want, through peacekeeping missions, through bilateral arrangements, and this gives them a great access to weapons. What we ask is not an embargo in terms of weapons. What we ask is an obligation of notification. Everyone who should sell weapons to Rwanda or transfer weapons to Rwanda should at least inform the Security Council. Why? Because we need to have a greater traceability of weapons that are being bought or sold to Rwanda or transferred to Rwanda, and seeing to what extent they find themselves back in the DRC, or are they all used only in peacekeeping missions. And the fourth point is peacekeeping missions. Rwanda is one of the largest troop contributing countries. And again, I remind us that in less than 72 hours, 17 peacekeepers were killed. And that was either by the M23 or by the Rwandan Defense Forces. It is unacceptable that Rwanda continues to receive funding from partner countries to train its troops in order to deploy them in peacekeeping missions. And it is unacceptable that Rwanda continues also to receive money from the UN as a troop contributing country. They should not be a troop contributing country. You cannot be a troop contributing country and pretend to be a peacekeeper when actually, in reality, you are a warmonger. And this is a status that has to be revoked as soon as possible, because it is, in such incoherence with the values of the United Nations, in such a flagrant incoherence that it is unacceptable and unconscionable. And this is also something that we have not just raised with the Security Council, but specifically with the UN Secretariat that is in partnership with the Rwandan government.
You've had a call, your president has had a call with Marco Rubio. Mm-hmm. How engaged are the US in trying to find a solution here? Because ostensibly on the world stage at the moment, we see them withdrawing. So I found it interesting that Marco Rubio has given Felix Tshisekedi a call, as well as Paul Kagame. Mm-hmm.
Well, the US was the first, not one of the first, but the first member of the Security Council that called out Rwanda on its interference in the DRC. And this is something that, when it happened, we welcomed, because it opened up the council to a more frank conversation on what is happening on the ground. And we do welcome the fact that despite the transition that the US is finding itself in, there is a continuity in that messaging in the Security Council. There is a continuity in that messaging also through other bodies. So I know that there is a lot going on in the US right now, and a lot of things are still taking shape, including also in the State Department, where we're still waiting for last appointments. But I think it is a welcome sign to see that there is a continuity in the concern of what is going on in Eastern DRC and the greater region, and that there is that contact. I was not privy to the call that Senator Rubio had with His Excellency Felix Tshisekedi. But I believe that it was a fruitful and constructive exchange, and I think it's important to continue these conversations. And it's also important that he reached out to President Kagame, because this is the advantage of certain countries. Certain countries have certain proximity to others or to many stakeholders and can relay messages in a manner that others may not be able to do. This is also the strategic advantage that the UK has. Its proximity to Rwanda means that, it is maybe so close that it could actually whisper some things in Kigali's ears that others would have to shout across the ocean.
I mean, we're not luckily in the era of the Rwanda scheme anymore, but did you, I know that you weren't in the post then, but did the DRC try to warn the UK when we were proposing deporting refugees to Rwanda that this was, and getting paid for it, that this was helpful to an autocrat who had designs on the DRC?
I think so, definitely. I think this was certainly part of the conversations that we had at the bilateral level in the respective capitals. And it was a problematic deal on so many issues, on so many levels. As you say, an autocratic regime getting, millions of pounds, but also just inherently, again, something very disturbing about this deal eroding some core principles of international law, of refugee law, and just having, two countries working on that and presenting it as a solution to a problem that actually, would be better solved if we addressed the root causes of the real challenges that we have in many countries that push people to flee their home countries. And for me, that was one very unfortunate aspect also of this whole deal. It was actually paving the way to eroding refugee law. At the same time, in a region that has been so impacted by displacement, internal and also beyond international borders. And, there was just an inherent dissonance between that scheme and the lived reality, also certainly of many Rwandans who, at some point, maybe decades ago, benefited also from the protection that international refugee law provided.
I'm going to open it to the floor in 1 second, but I have one more question in relation to sports washing. You have written a very firmly worded letter to Arsenal, to Bayern Munich, to Paris Saint-Germain. Tell us a little bit about what you want them to do and what feedback you have received.
In terms of feedback, we have not received any feedback.
Right.
Direct feedback. We took note of the fact that Bayern München has apparently sent a delegation to Rwanda to visit Rwanda, basically. We hope that they will visit also Rwanda's impact in Eastern DRC and not just stop in Rwanda. We also know that they have engaged consultations with the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is where we have seen at least a reaction. In the case of Paris Saint-Germain and Arsenal, we have not received any feedback whatsoever. I think, the objective here was to highlight the fact that we are in a context where Rwanda is very often presented as a success case, as a country worth visiting. And of course, certainly it is worth visiting, but at the same time, that the other side of the story is not being told. And the other side of the story is immense suffering that is caused just a mere 100 kilometers away from, where everybody is supposed to go visit the gorillas and so on and so forth. And it's holding also, or it's not necessarily holding accountable, but it's also just raising the question with all of these football clubs. Is this really what you stand for? Is this what you stand for in a day and age where, in less than 3 days, 3,000 people were killed? Is this the partnership that you still want to endorse and that you feel proud about, presenting to the world? Because we do believe that sports, and football in particular, which is the most popular sport in the DRC also, and probably many African countries and beyond, we do believe that sports are supposed to bring people together and not be there to be an instrument to draw away attention from something that is tearing families apart and ruining entire lives. And so our question is this what you stand for? And is this what your fans also stand for? Is this what your players stand for when they're on that pitch? Is that what you're defending? And maybe you've missed it, but this is what is happening. So, you know.
We shall see if Visit Rwanda gets taken off those shirts anytime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Who would like to ask a question?
Can I just steal the first question? Go on. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Melissa. You mentioned the South Africans and the peacekeeping forces. We know MONUSCO, they've all had quite a hard time. If we think forward 6 months, hopefully a peace deal is done and the Rwandan forces withdraw, that border is going to be a hot border. We've seen how fast they came across and did the damage. Who do you see taking over from MONUSCO? Is it a beefed up MONUSCO? Is it a revised African offering? Has any thought been given to that yet?
I think we're still at a stage where there is still a lot of processing going on. There is still a lot of focus on the imminent situation. And I think it is a thought that is pertinent. First of all, it is a responsibility of the Congolese government before even, you know, looking at MONUSCO, before even looking at a beefed up or potentially beefed up SADC presence. I think the homework is ours, first of all, you know, to assess and to have a review of what happened and to see what is it that we can do to prevent this from happening again. So this is, you know, the first priority. But when it comes to the other stakeholders, I think it's a bit premature to say what it could look like. There is a need to reflect on that, and I think there is a need also to reflect on you know, the level of risk that, you know, some are willing to take or not, and the level of protection that they have received from their mandating organizations. Again, you know, it raises the question of the Security Council sending peacekeepers to the DRC in a context that is clearly an international context, but the Security Council at the same time failing to designate it as such, and still remaining in that logic of, well, this is just, you know, a few Congolese left and right and whatever, yeah. You know, well, no, actually, no. It's 7,000 Rwandan troops, really well equipped with GPS and I don't know what, laser missiles and, yeah. So good luck with that. So I think this is going to push everyone to rethink also what is it that, you know, what is the theater that we're sending the troops in, and how are they equipped and supported in order to deliver on their mandates. And I think this is where there was a big shortcoming when the last MONUSCO mandate was adopted. We pushed extremely for that mandate to say explicitly that this is a conflict with the Rwandan Defense Forces on the ground, and the Security Council would not do it. And I think this contributed also to the fact that, you know, troops were not necessarily as adequately equipped and protected as they could have been with a much more robust mandate and a much more honest mandate.
If MONUSCO had been allowed to stand beside the Congolese army more robustly during that? Because, I mean, at the moment, they're basically in their bases in Goma, aren't they?
Well, because they have been encircled, because they are outgunned. Again, this is a reality. So again, when we don't have an honest assessment of the situation on the ground, then the response is never going to be adequate. And I think this is the problem that we had from the word go. You have a mission that is not sufficiently equipped to face the threat that it is facing. So how does it contribute to that solution if the threat itself is not being named?
Which is problematic when it's the biggest peacekeeping mission in the world.
Thank you for your presentation. I was listening keenly to the solutions that you recommended, and these are very important solutions that kind of like maybe stem the humanitarian kind of like crisis that can produce some effect in the short and medium term. But I was waiting to hear some kind of long-term solutions, maybe looking at some of the issues that have been raised, like integrating into the armies or integrating some of the people to the Congolese army. Some of these, because we recently had this podcast where that was raised as well. And then I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And then the second question is the wider geopolitical crisis, competition that's going on in Africa, whole of Africa, to be instance, like China, like Russia, like what impact are these? Because I keep hearing keep mentioning some of the Western governments. How about this, like Russia, China? What impact are they having in the crisis, in escalating or de-escalating the issues there?
So on the first question regarding long-term solution, the unfortunate advantage of having to look back at 30 years of instability is that you also have a good overview of long-term effects of some very bad solutions. One of them being integrating armed groups into the army. And this is something where President Tshisekedi has been very firm. We have learned the very tough lessons from the past of having armed groups gaining access to political, administrative, military power through the barrel of the gun. And as soon as there was a semblance or an effort to moderate or to govern better, they would push back. They would run back to the guns. So this is a lesson that we learned the hard way over the long term. And it is in no way a long-term solution. The PDDRCS, so the National Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration Program, is specifically learning from those lessons to make sure that when it comes to armed groups, we offer pathways out of armed groups back into civilian life, but not integration within the army, and certainly not, trading your AK-47 for general stars, as it was done 20 years ago. Because this is precisely what is making our army so fragile. The fact that there is a lack of cohesion, the fact that the army has been puzzled together over decades by just integrating this one. Oh, you're threatening XYZ, well, why don't you just join the army? This has to be over. And I think it is important precisely when we're looking for lessons that we as the DRC, a sovereign state, of course welcome the support and the contributions from so many concerned parties and allies and partners, but we have to be able to push back and say, we've been there, that's not happening again. And this is exactly the same thing when I speak about negotiating with armed groups and making sure that there is a framework for these armed groups and making sure that we do not fall back into the traps of elevating certain armed groups to a specific status or to a privileged position because they have wreaked havoc. These are lessons that we learned the hard way. And so when we look at the perspective of integration, I think it is something that we have to deal with a lot of maturity and wisdom, based also from the lessons that were learned in the past, even though these were not mistakes that we made, because it was a completely different team at the time. The second issue, of course, you cannot be the DRC. This is the founding story of our country. You cannot be the DRC and not be coveted by everyone. This is what has always defined us. So there is a reality to that. Now, to what extent do we let it determine or take over our reflection, take over our capacity to say, nonetheless, despite the fact that we have competing interests, despite the fact that we are in a global setting where there is even more polarization, that does not discharge us of the responsibility to think on our own and to think how we position ourselves in that setting. And I think it's important, not just for the DRC, and it is something that we're seeing in a lot of other countries, to be able to stand our ground and say, you can have your arguments, but at the same time, don't impose on us having to choose. Just as some countries, some big powers still maintain links. There's tensions between two countries, of course, but your iPhone is still being produced in the other one and bought in your home. There are links. And yet, when it comes to the African continent, there is that expectation that we have to be drastic. We just have to be on one side and never ever on the other side. And at the same time, no, it is our sovereign right to be able to choose our partners and also to evolve in these choices, right? Because you learn. And that's something that I say in a very candid manner to all the diplomats I talk to. When I look at the crisis, I say, I'm learning so much about you. I'm learning so much about you in our time of need. That is so edifying, because it means that tomorrow I really know how you stand on certain issues. So we have to give ourselves, we have to take that full ownership, but we also have to give ourselves the leeway to say positions can evolve, and they have to be informed also on the way certain countries behave in certain circumstances.
Hello, Minister.
Hello.
Two questions. One is, you explained what came out of the summit, and so my question is, you've got the Luanda process and the Nairobi one. How actually you're suggesting they should still continue as initiatives under a kind of overarching mandate? How do you think practically that will work? I mean, the Luanda versus the Nairobi one. So that's one question. And the second one is, SADC obviously has lost troops in DRC. What more would you like to see SADC do? Thank you.
So on the first question, in terms of the Luanda and Nairobi processes, yesterday was a summit between heads of states, and I know that there were discussions also in seeing how these two instruments under the umbrella of the AU can be bolstered. There is an ongoing reflection on seeing whether the group of facilitators, or if you want the duo of facilitators for now, so President Lorenzo of Angola for the Luanda process and President Kenyatta for the Nairobi process, on whether it's, would be useful and of an added value to broaden that scope and to include other facilitators that could lend to this joint process greater clout, if you want. So I think this is work in progress, because we have seen certain limitations. We have seen also certain pushback. We have heard declarations that were a bit puzzling, because I think we were all under the impression that we were looking for African solutions to African problems, even though President Kagame sought out President Erdogan for a mediator role. So, this is something where we are cognizant of the fact that, the setup may need to be bolstered in a certain manner, and I think this is an ongoing conversation which will probably also continue in the margins of the AU summit later this week. So I think again we have to be patient in terms of seeing this take shape, and seeing also to what extent this bolstering can also help address some of the shortcomings that were identified in the design process. For example, the fact that the processes did not provide for participation of civil society organizations, of women in a structured manner. So I think this is maybe an opportunity to see how through this fusion everything can be beefed up and deliver better on the promise, if you want, of these two processes. When it comes to SADC, we're fully cognizant of the immense sacrifices that SADC countries have made in the DRC, not just in this specific crisis, but we have had other occurrences. I remember the attack on Tanzanian peacekeepers that cost the life of, I think, 14 or 17 peacekeepers in just one attack. And so there is a debt that we will always have towards SADC. At the same time, it is a region that in itself is also very dynamic right now. We see that there's a lot of domestic pressures on the different SADC troop contributing countries. And so there again, it is going to take time also for us to reflect on what is it that we can expect more from SADC. What is extremely important is that we focus also on the political aspect of this crisis, and being able to have a language that holds stakeholders accountable. So SADC's role is not just one in terms of providing troops on the ground. It is also being a moral compass. It is also reminding us of these obligations that we have under international law, and it is also, holding one another accountable and making sure that we have a truthful and honest conversation about what is going on the ground. And so, when we think about what we can expect from SADC, I don't want to reduce it to just the military aspect. because at the same time, SADC is also a political powerhouse, and we count on that too.
Possibly also take more of a role if MONUSCO's departure at some point does leave a vacuum. Who? Michaela.
Hello. I was in Kinshasa when the AFDL marched on it with a lot of other journalists, and this movement that nobody had believed would get to Kinshasa overturned, and Mobutu took the next flight out. I'm just wondering, how seriously you take Okone Nanga's talks of marching to Kinshasa. The speculation has always been, what does Kagame, what is he after? What do you think he's after? Is it balkanization, annexation, or is it regime change?
Well, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand when it comes to his objectives. I think Paul Kagame is cognizant of the fact that as long as you have a legitimate government in Kinshasa, it is in no way conceivable that we would accept a balkanization or an annexation of part of our territory. This is why he is backing a group that clearly champions violent regime change. And where we remember what it looked like in the late 90s, it was precisely that. It was in order to use Kinshasa, if you want, as the control tower, if you want, of the systematic pillaging of the East and of other resources of the DRC. So, of course, we do not take these threats lightly. It's our responsibility as a government to uphold the constitutional order and to make sure that we are prepared for any threats. So, I would never say that we're downplaying them. But at the same time, I think it's important to highlight the fact that, President Kagame has been using the interesting pretext, if you want, of the Congolese government criticizing his government and being a threat to his government to actually pass to action, to go from speaking to actually concretely backing a rebel group that seeks violent regime change. Now, what is interesting, again, we already tried to draw the parallel between M23 version 1 and then, RDF Remix 2025, we see that history never repeats in the similar manner. And so even while we may have the memory of the AFDL, we also have to be cognizant of everything else that has changed in the meantime, of what it means to try to have such an endeavor in 2025. What does it mean in a day and age where I think we are diplomatically much more robust than we were at the time? In a day and age where we are documenting everything, in a day and age where we are exercising so much more pressure than was the case. So it hasn't also been 30 years of inaction. I think we all had 30 years to study President Kagame thoroughly. And everybody now really knows him and knows what he stands for. And I think this is a big advantage compared to what it was like a few decades ago. Now, the important thing is to use that knowledge in a strategic manner, to use that knowledge in a way that prevents greater suffering, that prevents more displacement and the killing of innocent civilian lives.
Hello? Yes. Do you have a position from the UK government around what's happening at the moment?
I mean, we have seen, I think we've all seen and read and heard the numerous statements, and I think they are as indicative as can be of the UK's position. As I said, we welcome the fact that as of December, for the first time, the UK had an explicit position on the role of Rwanda in Eastern DRC. I think that was a very important step. And ever since, we have seen that the language has also been more and more robust. So that is encouraging, of course. But that is the UK position for now. a lot of firm statements, but we have yet to see the action that goes hand in hand with that. I know that policy takes time. I know that, governance takes time. But I think there is a clear visibility of the UK's position on the situation in Eastern DRC and on the government's reading of Rwanda's role. So I think there has been very clear communication on that. What we deplore and what we regret is that there has not been any firm action despite very firm statements. And so we are looking forward to seeing that take more robust shape, because if there's one lesson that we have learned in the past weeks, it's that President Kagame does not react to statements, he does not react to declarations, and apparently also not to phone calls. And again, this is not a mystery. President Kagame has been in power for the past 30 years, so I think everybody has also a good understanding of pressure points that can be used and that can be, on which pressure can be applied to generate greater response, because there has been no response to all of these calls and declarations, despite a very clear, now increasingly clear and robust UK position and UK stance. There has been no response on the side of Rwanda.
I was wondering in relation to whether Bob Amsterdam was still here, but I don't see him. But I think it's worth talking about DRC taking Apple to court for the exploitation of coltan, and knowingly, although they deny it, using stuff mined in Rubaya via Rwanda. Do you think that that is a template that you will take further to other big tech companies? And what kind of a message do you want to say to big tech right now?
The message is clear, and it's a message that we send to big tech, but that we also send to other potential investors in the DRC. We're open for business. So just come to us, skip the middleman. Skip the middleman and skip the horrible human rights violations that that you contribute to by going through that channel, right? So that is the message in a nutshell. And of course, we're cognizant of the fact that it is not only Apple that is benefiting from natural resources that are mined or minerals that are mined in the DRC and sold under a Rwandan label. So of course, these efforts are not going to just target one company, and we are exploring ways to make sure that this advocacy has more impact. But at the same time, it is also for us a responsibility to see how do we create an environment that is more conducive to attract these companies. Of course, it's particularly difficult in Eastern DRC because of the insecurity, but this is a reflection that we're pushing in other parts of the DRC that are much more secure. What is it that we have to do in terms of our business environments to make it more hospitable, if you want, to different stakeholders and different partners to further diversify and to clearly send out the message, we're open for business. Skip the middleman. Skip the middleman and skip the horrible human rights record. And do something good and just come to the DRC and do clean business and invest in the DRC, invest in value chains that actually contribute to sustainable development and not to instability.
And hope that in the end, some of that mineral wealth does trickle down to the people who need it. At the back.
Thank you. Over the past few weeks, we've seen a robust mobilization from members of the diaspora in Brussels, Paris, New York, here in London as well, and especially from a younger generation who was too young back in 2012, and some of them are not as familiar as others about the conflict in its own. But a lot of them still feel very helpless, given that obviously they are members of their diaspora. Some of them have never been back in the DRC. What's your message to them? What can the diaspora do to support the DRC at the moment? Thank you.
I think that's a great question, because I feel, because in my attributions as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I also have the diaspora. And it is for me an untapped resource that, is full of so much potential and so much wealth. It's unfortunate that it is in such a situation that we tap into the potential of the diaspora. We would want to, or we ought to be tapping into that also at other moments. But in this specific case, I think the first advice that I would give is, first of all, recommend to members of the diaspora to inform themselves, to educate themselves as much as they can on the situation on the ground, but also to use their positions, their geographic positions, to share the information on what's going on in Eastern DRC. The diaspora also has, depending on which generations you're looking at, depending on demographics and legal status, if you want, they also have different leverages that they can use. The diaspora is not necessarily Congolese living in the UK as Congolese citizens. They can also be, naturalized UK citizens, French citizens. And so there is that leverage also of saying, well, you've studied in the UK or you've studied in France, you've got your job, you're paying your taxes. I think it's a legitimate question to ask yourself and to ask the government, what's happening with my tax money? Where is that going? And to ask the person who sits next to you when you're having lunch at your job where you pay taxes, to say, well, what is actually happening with our tax money? Is this going there, really? And so, there's many entry points to start these conversations and to explore different ways of influencing what is going on. First in terms of amplifying the information, but also in terms of bringing that conversation back to where you are. And I think there is a very natural link because you identify, or because the diaspora identifies with the country, but at the same time, because the diaspora contributes in the respective countries where they are to the economy. And so, they also have a role to play in that society, and means that they also have a voice. And so it's also seeing how that can be used in order to influence in a positive manner, at least the public debate on an issue, if not further.
Foreign Minister, thank you very much for your time and for talking through what is an incredibly difficult, terrifying humanitarian situation. And I think the DRC are very lucky to have you campaigning and bringing a voice to all of those who need it on the ground at the moment, to all the various world platforms where you have been speaking and will continue. And I think all of us here wish you luck in your endeavour to resolve and bring some kind of peace to Eastern DRC. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you to Diana for chairing this fantastic meeting. Your diary is hell, I know, so thank you for giving us your time tonight. I have a small apology to make. I've been watching the screen on YouTube at the back, and to all the people who've been saying out there in YouTube land, ask us questions, let us ask questions. This was very hastily put together, but next time we will certainly have somebody in the corner of the laptop relaying the questions. There's been a lot of interest out there on the topic tonight, so thank you very much. All of you, thank you for coming. There are light refreshments, so please enjoy yourselves, and thank you.
Thank you.